elaborate a little more in reference how war uses that particular disrespect when it comes to control, especially of the women as well as the men?
With regard to your question, we know that war is a tool for plunder. We also know that war is politics by other means. That is to say, that oftentimes war leads to the shifting of wealth. When the Europeans, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese, followed by the English, the French et al., begin to plunder Africa and the Americas, they go a step further, as you know, in Africa, and take many of the able bodied individuals and oftentimes leave the elderly. In my classes, oftentimes ask my students what would happen on the west coast of the United States of America if at some point China sent ships across to the land stretching from Seattle to San Diego and takes all the software engineers and takes all the medics and takes all of the carpenters and mechanics and take them back to China and leave the elderly. Well, the west coast of the United States, I dare say, will fall upon hard times. And in a sense, that's really what the Europeans do, particularly in West Africa, because it's now well known that if you look at the growing of rice in South Carolina, which becomes a major crop both before and after the founding of the United States of America, the slave traders, when they went into certain parts of Africa, particularly sought out agriculturalists who had knowledge about rice growing, and they particularly sought out certain craftspeople. Many of the ironworks that you see in a place like New Orleans, for example, it was done by African craftspersons who were targeted during the African slave trade, which is one of them, also a reason why the most significant prison in Louisiana, interestingly enough, is called Angola State Prison. That's not an accident that it's named after this Southwest African nation. But as I said in my book on Zimbabwe, the war and these systems of exploitation not only involve the plundering of wealth, it involves the exporting of an aggressive libido referring to the sex drive. And so part of the plunder of war is not only wealth, part of the plunder of war, believe it or not, is seen to be women. That is to say, oftentimes in war is you kill the men and rape the women. And what's interesting, if you look at my book on the 16th century, what had the Western Europeans so upset, and as I point out, that's one of the reasons they were fleeing west, because they feared that the Muslims were marching steadily westward. Just like the Muslims had taken over what is now Istanbul in 1453, that city in Turkey, the major city in Turkey, has been predominantly Muslim ever since. The idea is that the Muslims would then move on to the Vatican, which, as you know, is sited in Italy, and what we now call Italy. And there was this perception that Muslim invaders not only took the wealth, not only raped the women, but they also raped the men. Check out my book and follow the footnotes. And so this question of an aggressive, violent libido is also present during the time of slavery. If you look at the current edition of the New York-based weekly, The Nation, a left-leaning journal, I think today is May 12th. The edition, I think, may carry that date. I have a review essay on W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, wherein he talks about what he terms, quote, the sexual chaos that exists under US slavery. By sexual chaos, he's talking about not only rape, what I just made reference to, rape of Black women. One of the reasons why Black people come in so many colors is because of the systematic and systematized rape of Black women. But also the fact that there was breeding of Black people, just like you have breeding of cows. A man who just lost the race to be governor, Republican nominee for governor of Nebraska, he's made a fortune by selling bull semen, which supposedly helps to produce cows and beef that is an exquisite measure. And likewise, the slave owners, particularly in Virginia, were seeking to breed Africans. In fact, in my book, The Deepest South, United States, Brazil, and the African Slave Trade, one of the points you will learn is that in the 1840s, you had US slave traders who ironically and paradoxically were seeking to curtail the slave trade from Angola and Mozambique to Brazil, not because they were humanitarians, but because they wanted to breed Africans like their cows in Virginia and then sell them into Brazil. So these are some of the heinous episodes that I'm afraid to say too many have forgotten, but I'm not sure it's been altogether forgotten in the Black community. I see it as a kind of repressed memory syndrome. You may recall that repressed memory syndrome involves an individual who has something so horrific, so horrible, so atrocious, so terrible happen that in order to live and exist, they have to repress the memory. But they still act out on the basis of being treated horrifically and atrociously. In a certain sense, you could say that the Black community, or at least a segment of it, has been enduring a kind of repressed memory syndrome where we may not recall all the specifics and details of what happened to us as a people, what particularly befell Black women, but we're acting that out somehow in 2022. Speaking to you in New York in particular, I would be remiss if I failed to note the fact that until recently, in Manhattan, just north of Brooklyn, you had a statue honoring J. Marion Sims, Marion with an O, M-A-R-I-O-N, who is viewed as a pioneer of OBGYN, the medicine and science of women's bodies. The statue was removed after we were able to show that he was a ghoulish experimenter on the bodies of enslaved African women. That's how he was able to, quote, perfect, unquote, his devices and his methodologies with regard to OBGYN. And J. Marion, in some ways, is a metaphor for the mistreatment and maltreatment of Black women